Hello, everyone. This is World Review. I'm Daalder, the president of the Chicago Council. Also joining us, Carla.
I suppose the most important takeaway is the fact that the pandemic is a defining crisis of our times, right? I mean, the fact that the whole UNGA was virtual was remarkable in and of itself, and pandemic has come at a time when the multilateral system is dealing with a rise in nationalism, even xenophobia in some cases, a rejection in some cases of globalism, questioning free trade and so on and so forth, and then the overarching problem of the U.S.-China, sort of the building confrontational attitude between the U.S. and China. So, the UNGA, normally there's a big flurry in New York, as those of us who have the misfortune of covering it know, the gridlock and all that. But after that week is over, there's a lot of fuss about it, and then it's sort of, life goes on, right? But what is interesting, I think this year also is, number one, China's President Xi Jinping made an interesting speech in which he enhanced China's climate pledges, and that intentionally or unintentionally sort of highlights the fact that the United States has sort of stepped back, abdicated some of the leadership of the consensus on climate change, which had been so painstakingly built over the years, right? A second issue was the snapback sanctions on Iran, where the United States was somewhat isolated. I mean, very lukewarm support for what the US is doing, snapping back sanctions. And we have to get back to Iran a little bit later, I think, because it's such a big issue. But that was one takeaway. And then, you had the so-called group of four, the Japan, India included, saying that the Security Council permanent membership should be expanded. They've been saying this for a long time. And I actually looked it up. And last time the Security Council was expanded by adding non-permanent members was 1965. I mean, 1965, think of it. So it is widely acknowledged that the UN does need reform. It really does. And I hope that one can only hope that that going forward, these calls will not be forgotten, because in the shadow of these greater crises that we face. And multilateralism, of course, right? I mean, the smaller countries depend on the UN, and again, ironically, it is the fact that the UNGA was virtual and we faced this pandemic that underscores the need for a multilateral response to transnational threats. Climate change, the pandemic, transnational organized crime, there's a list of them. So 75 years, yes, but it certainly needs a second look and reform.
Philip, is it right to say, as I think Nirmal is implying, that in some ways never has multilateralism been more necessary, and yet never has at least the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council been more divided and more impotent in dealing with this, with the challenges that we face? Is that a good way to think about this?
Yes, I think Nirmal's absolutely right. I mean, the really painful paradox of our times, as it were, is that, and the pandemic has pointed this up, but so too climate change, is that we really do need collective action to deal with the biggest problems, the biggest challenges to our security. And we're in a world which is fragmenting and fracturing and moving back towards a nationalist approach. And this isn't the worst moment for the UN. I think you could probably say that probably, during the Cold War, the UN was immobilized for much of the time. But post the end of the Cold War, we look forward to a period where the UN could actually take collective action. It would be unblocked, as it were. And for about a decade, I suppose up to the high point of responsibility to protect, the UN did look as if it was going to become the centerpiece of sort of global collective action to deal with global problems. That's now all gone. It's basically now reflecting the great power competition between the US and China, as Nirmal said, but also the differences, as he also said, within the alliance between the Europeans and the Americans over Iran. And I think it does need modernizing in terms of the membership of the Security Council, but I don't think that of itself would solve the problem. We need collective action, but we don't have the collective will of national governments to provide that action.
Carla, as both Nirmal and Philip pointed out, that there was a contrast between the speeches of President Trump and President Xi in the sense that if you didn't know who was speaking, you would have thought that the Trump speech would have normally been given by a Chinese leader about the importance of national sovereignty and independence and everyone needing to take care of themselves, and President Xi's speech would normally have been given by an American president about the importance of collaborating, of cooperating, of working together, of making sure that the multilateral system worked in the way. And yet, that's not what happened. Are we just seeing a transfer of power, a shift here in some ways? And you're still on mute.
So, if we're going to be having cool facts, President Trump's speech apparently set a record for brevity. He only spoke for 8 minutes, which tells you something about how President Trump feels either about speaking without an audience or about how he feels about multilateralism. And this was an incredibly in-your-face speech in which he got up and said, we're doing a fabulous job with the pandemic, we're doing a fabulous job with everything else. And by the way, multilateralism, what a failure. He's done this before in UN speeches, but this was an incredible blow-off speech. And by the way, the longest speech in history was Fidel Castro in 1960 at 4 hours and 29 minutes. I looked that up too. But the Chinese speech is, yes, the Chinese have been playing this ever since the U.S. pulled out of the climate accord. They say they're going to take leadership at the WTO. But this speech, I think more than anything else, was an atonement speech on the part of the Chinese. They have a lot to answer for, specifically because of COVID. And there was a lot, Trump called them out, but more than anything else, the rest of the world has been calling them out too. So there was a lot of atonement there. And there was also sort of the pretension that we've heard all along from Xi, which is, I'm going to pick up where the Americans left off. So I think both of those things were going on there.
Well, we're seeing this fluidity, I think, in the international order playing out in one form or another. And the other issue that Nirmal mentioned, Philip, is the question of the Iran sanctions. And here you had, in some ways, one of the great successes of the UN is a negotiation that was blessed by the UN Security Council that led to the reaffirmation and putting into place of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015, and the United States walking away from that deal in 2018 and trying to use the UN, the very UN mechanisms to stick it to the Iranians first and foremost, but also apparently to our allies. How is this playing out, and help us understand really what's going on here with the Iran and the snapback?
Well, it was a success for the UN, but it started off with a success for the Atlantic Alliance. Here was a deal that was initially the Europeans, the European three, the French, the Germans, and the British, paved the way for this deal, persuaded the US to come in, and then reach an agreement which was by no means perfect, but put off at least for a decade Iranian progress, as it were, towards a nuclear weapon. It was rejected by the Trump administration. The administration left the agreement. As a result of that, as a consequence of that, UN sanctions, UN-wide sanctions on arms sales to Iraq actually expired. And the US was trying to get those reinstated, as it were. But here, and this is the issue that most divides the Europeans and the US or the Trump administration. The Europeans, even before Mr. Trump's speech at the UN, said, look, you no longer have the right to decide what happens vis-a-vis Iran. You left the agreement, therefore you can't reimpose sanctions. You can't get the UN to snap back sanctions. Now, this isn't because Europeans want to sell the Iranians weapons. No one's going to do that. This is not because the Europeans think that the deal is perfect, but they think that something can be rescued from the deal. And we're now in a position where the Europeans and the Americans are basically shouting at each other over this. And the European view is we're going to have to wait for the election and see whether Mr. Trump is re-elected, because Joe Biden has said he would get the United States to rejoin the agreement. And then together, the Europeans and Americans could seek a tighter deal, as it were. And the Iranians are sitting it out, saying, look, we signed the deal. We're not gonna change.
It's a big Carla, as Philip said, a big fight between the Europeans, our allies, both on the Iranian issue, but more importantly, our allies writ large, really united against the United States on this particular issue. How is the U.S. thinking that they can actually move forward on this? They've made their point, but in the end, how are they going to actually get something done?
Well, I mean, the way they got Iran to the table in the first place, to be perfectly frank, I mean, there's a huge amount of power in secondary sanctions. And that's what the idea is here. I mean, Macron at his UNGA speech, which I think was so far the longest speech to continue this week, to continue a theme at 48 minutes, secondary sanctions are very powerful. And that's what they announced. And they're trying to bully companies that that continue to deal with Iran, saying that they're not going to have access to, U.S. banking system, to U.S. businesses and all. And that's why Iran came to the table in the first place in the Iran deal. Financial sanctions are very powerful. Now, the Iranians are saying that the Americans can't hurt them anymore. Certainly bilateral sanctions have no impact because we have no dealing with Iran in the first place. But when the Americans continued to reimpose and continued to threaten, Iran's currency reached a new low last week. The Iranians are aware that the Americans still have a lot of power.
Nirmal, how does folks in your region in Southeast Asia and the Chinese, who are, of course, are also a member of this Iranian deal, how are they looking at this situation where this deep division between traditional allies, the Western allies on Iran, but a deep division that actually has the US on one side, but using the power that it has through the financial markets to try to impose its will? What's the sentiment there in terms of US policy, but also the impact on the multilateral system?
Well, first, I think what Carla said about secondary sanctions being very powerful, that's an interesting aspect of this. These sanctions are extremely aggressive, and we'll have to see how they play out. But otherwise, there is sort of a skepticism of sanctions in general as a tool of foreign policy. They have not really worked, and in many places they have not worked. In some cases, you can always argue that they do. In some cases, like South Africa, for example, Burma, they did not work. So it's instructive also to think about Iran itself, right? I mean, you could argue that Iran is fundamentally a liberal country, and the general population does not like the religious leadership, the mullahs, but the general population likes Western ideas, freedoms, and so forth. But they're also nationalists. So, a sanction, and people are suffering because of sanctions, and they will suffer more now. And that is not, but they are yet far from either the government coming to the US on its knees. Iran is unlikely to do that. Yes, they came to the table before, which was, that worked, but the stakes are a little higher now. They're further along. They've restarted very incrementally, very gradually their nuclear program. So there's pressure on both sides. And China is always there to rescue them. I mean, if you look at the agreements that the US has made recently, has engineered rather, in the Middle East, right? Israel, Bahrain, Israel, UAE. It sort of appears to be consolidating a web, an anti-Iranian web in the region, right? Iran is going to look for other friends, and China is very much there. So I think that I think there is a lot of skepticism about the objective of sanctions. What is the objective? Number one, is it bring Iran to the table? Number two, is it to have a general uprising and overthrow the Islamic leadership? What is the objective? In between, the economy is going to, it is already in pretty bad shape, and Iranians are going to suffer, and Iranian hardline public opinion will always be, will become more and more anti-American, and that doesn't serve the purpose.
Well, I think Nirmal's got the point right. What's the goal here, and who are we trying? What's the strategy to get to that goal? If you're not clear about the goal, and at times it is to end the nuclear program, at times it is to end the Iranian regime. The two are not necessarily unrelated, presumably. But that's a real, Carla, jump in here.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, what a surprise. The Trump administration is not clear about its goals on something. I mean, if you talk to people in the State Department and special envoys on this, and I think regime change really is the goal within the bureaucracy itself, such as it is, or certainly within the political leaders within the State Department and some people within the Defense Department, certainly within the White House. But if you listen to the president, I think the president is still in his, I'm going to win a Nobel Peace Prize on one of these things. And he keeps saying the moment he's reelected that the Iranians are going to come to the table. And his love affair with North Korea, I mean, if the Iranians were to show, can I say this? It's in such bad taste, show a little bit of ankle on this. I think he would be willing to cut some sort of a deal with them. I mean, he wants a deal. And so we'll see if he is re-elected in this. So and he controls this. It doesn't matter really what Pompeo wants. Pompeo wants regime change. Trump wants a deal. We'll see if he is re-elected which way this one goes. I mean, certainly North Korea is going nowhere.
Yeah, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, has actually said he's afraid that if a very hard, real hardliner on Iran, he said he's afraid that if Mr. Trump's re-elected, then he will strike a deal because he'll see the deal as more important than the issue. I mean, I think, Carla's right about these sanctions being really painful, and it'll cause some serious problems for Europeans if they continue in the sort of beyond this year. I think the view in Europe at the moment is that everyone can stand this, for the short term and see how things turn out, and wait for the new president next year, whether it's Mr. Trump seeking a deal or Mr. Biden going, seeking to go back into it. But no one I know, no diplomat I know, thinks that the Iranians are at the point where they will sort of give in, and it's on a significant level. They used to pay. This is the Iran that fought the Iraqis, armed by the West through the 1980s, and took an extreme amount of pressure. I don't think they're at the point where they're going to give in to this sort of pressure at the moment.
Carla, let's switch gears and talk about another issue that came to the forefront this week, which is the strong push by the Trump administration to ban Chinese owned and operated apps, starting with TikTok, which they're trying to force to be sold to an American company. And of course, WeChat, the most important app in the Chinese app store, which controls conversation and sales and payments and everything else. Courts are stepping in, companies are stepping in. It's all a little confusing, but what's the real purpose here by the administration, and how are they going about it?
Well, this is a bit of a trade war, a bit of a national security issue, a legitimate national security issue. And, you got 100 million American users of TikTok who Trump runs a very real possibility of pissing off in the midst of a political campaign. So I downloaded TikTok last weekend after the White House threatened to pull it from the App Store. There's nothing like the possibility of scarcity to make you want to do something. And let me just say to begin with that Twitter is still overwhelmingly my drug of choice, although the singing dogs are very cool. And there's something oddly satisfying. There's something called oddly satisfying. And there are clips of people doing repetitive things, which is sort of the white noise thing of social media, which I do recommend that. So TikTok is a wholly owned company. It's a startup by ByteDance, and the Trump administration's declared concerns is that China can use it first to steal the data of 100 million devoted American users and potentially use the app's recommendation algorithm. This is the secret sauce of it to surface political content. And that's not an inconsiderable concern given what we know, A, about what Facebook can do, and B, the Chinese are certainly getting into the misinformation business, and C, they've built their entire industry on their ability to do IP theft, and data theft. So there's something very real going on here, but given the permeability of the internet, can you really, force people? Okay, well, so we'll force them to sell part of TikTok, and then another app will come up. And then there's the potential for retaliation, which China is already threatening to retaliate. So it's been nearly a week since the Trump administration semi-blessed this deal. And the deal that it's supposed to be is that Oracle and Walmart will buy 20% of a new supposedly American-owned company, TikTok Global, for American users. Although really not sure what was agreed to and whether Beijing is going to go along with it. So in theory, Oracle gets a cloud computing contract, which means the US data would stay in the US, making it harder to steal. Walmart gets a merchandising deal. And as for the code, which is this question about what they can recommend and how much they can play with our heads, including my, since I now have a TikTok app, Oracle supposedly will get to see it, but China insists it's not going to give up control to it. And China's now saying they're not clear that they're going to approve it. And then, ByteDance is saying that the other 80% is going to remain in ByteDance's hands. And Trump is saying he's not going to let it go through if ByteDance doesn't let it go. I know I'm going on because it's really, really complicated. In other words, nobody knows. And the other big question is China's saying it could potentially retaliate in the same way against an American company. This is a trade war. It's a trade war with very legitimate national security concerns, much like Huawei was. And eventually, we are going to have to figure out, are there rules of the road here? The Chinese live on IP theft. The Chinese are getting into the misinformation business, but the internet is out there and it's hugely global and hugely permeable. And this is going to turn into whack-a-mole. I just cannot imagine that we can keep forcing the Chinese to divest companies without them trying to force us to divest companies.
Nirmal, how does this play out in Southeast Asia? In some ways, even more squeezed of all places in the world between the Chinese, where there is a large penetration, is that the right word, into the market with its apps and the technology. But the same is true for the United States. I mean, Facebook and Twitter and Google and Apple devices and Microsoft are pretty dominant companies all over the world. How does this play?
But not in China.
But not in China, but certainly outside of China, in Singapore and other places. How is this trade war, this attempt to perhaps even divide the internet, being seen as affecting the national security and national economic interest of countries in the region?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I agree with everything Carla said. And another thing to remember is that China, but there's been a bit of a divided internet already all along because of the Great Firewall in China and stuff. So people in that region are sort of used to navigating this. And yes, now there's going to be increasing scrutiny of these apps. India did the same with TikTok, right? Quite recently. But seeing it in the context of the larger trade war, the larger idea of decoupling, supply chains and so forth, the view in the region is it is very hard to do this. I mean, if you believe in global capitalism, if you believe in the capitalist system, then capitalism will always find the lower means of the lower cost of production, right? That's what it does. So this goes against that whole principle. And I think I saw a report or a survey just the other day which said that very few American companies have actually completely decoupled from China, a very small percentage. Yes, a lot of them have moved some operations up to, for example, Vietnam and so forth, but very few have actually decoupled completely from China, a small action. So why would they? Why would they? When patriotism is one thing, but you don't indulge in patriotism if you can't sell your stuff anymore in the market because it's too expensive, right? So there are all these paradoxes, inherent paradoxes still have to be sorted out. As Carla said, with the TikTok deal in America, similarly, people are waiting to see what exactly happens at the end of it. I mean, who owns what, and whether the idea of making a deal sort of trumps national security. I mean, one can be tactical and strategic, yes, and also make a good deal. So that's the fine balancing line. And I think that's a balancing line everybody is looking to find in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general. And it's still a work in progress.
Philip, how is Europe is being squeezed in the same way that so many others are already had the Huawei debate, but now this is coming on top of it as well, and you're still muted.
I think actually there are two big and serious issues tangled up in this one. One is, and it's not to do necessarily with China and the US, one is who owns our data? And does data belong to individuals, and also does it belong to nations? So let me give you a small example. There's a concern in Britain that if Britain does a post-Brexit trade deal with the United States, this will give access to big US companies to UK health data. We mine a lot of health data because we have a national health system, and it's a very sensitive issue about whether American companies, but it could be French companies or German companies, should have access to this data, which is, quotes, British. So there's that issue, which I think is an issue for every country around the world. That, with China, gets entangled with this issue about, is the technology being used for disinformation, for active spying of one sort or another, or more aggressive collection of data that no one wants to give. And I think what we're seeing in Europe now is mostly at the European Commission, which does a lot of the work, is trying to find, someone said earlier, some rules of the road, both about who owns the data and under what conditions can data be transferred from one country to another. And then secondly, what protections national governments, or in the case of Europe, the European Union, can set up against the intrusive use of technology by rivals, competitors, and adversaries. And the Europe, having been pretty soft on China, is now looking with taking a tougher line. Even Germany, which has worried in the past about upsetting its commercial relationship, is now taking a harder line. So, but we're not there yet. I mean, I think people basically sympathize with the idea that the United States should be doing something to protect itself, but are sort of saying, is this just Trump making it up as he goes? Or, is the US beginning to develop a strategy, a set of rules which will apply equally and fairly to companies around the world? And that's where we're not at yet, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, Philip, because it seems to me that ultimately, if we're going to resolve or address this in a comprehensive way, it's got to be addressed comprehensively. And if you can't get global rules because the technology allows nefarious actors to interfere in ways that you don't want them, then are there other rules that like-minded countries, the democracies, and I note that Boris Johnson has proposed a D10 on the technology side for 5G, but you can extend that. Countries like Australia and New Zealand and others, India as a democracy and others, to be part of a discussion of the rules on who owns the data, how it is protected, and then how your security systems are protected too. I think part of the problem, of course, is This is complicated, and it's private companies that own the technology and the ability of governments to regulate this. Is something that I think the European Union has found hard to do, but so have so many others. But it seems to me, an issue that goes well beyond China. It is an issue we're all going to be talking and confronting in the future. Carla.
But you Ivo and Philly make a very, very good point, which is we need a united front with like-minded countries on this. There is no sign that the Trump administration has a strategy. One of the reasons why there is such chaos on this deal right now is because Oracle and Walmart don't even know what was agreed to with ByteDance. They, the deal that was approved by CFIUS, this committee that approves national security deals, was so rushed out, and the paper, the red marks that were so confusing that nobody really knows, because Trump was rushing out because he wanted to announce the deal anyway in the midst of a political campaign. We've seen this time and again. There needs to be, certainly like-minded countries need to have a common front, because let's not forget, more than anything else, these apps, they may be the jewels of Chinese technology. For the first time, they're not stealing something, they're actually creating things. But what do they use their apps more than anything else? They use them for social control inside their own country. And so there's a very, very good reason to be afraid of them, and to present a common front to the Chinese and say, if you want to sell these apps internationally, you have to deal with them differently from the way you deal with them at home, or we're not buying. So I'm not opposed to this, but doing it, one-off whack-a-mole without a sense of what the norms are going to be is pointless.
No, I think that's another good point. And I think, as I said, I think we're going to be with this for quite a while, because it's devilishly complicated, and it becomes even more complicated if you do it on an ad hoc basis rather than within an agreed framework that so many of us are trying to get to.
Download before Sunday, because right now it's still supposed to be unless there's a deal, it's out of the App Store by Sunday.
I may, whether I sign up is a different deal, but all my kids have them, so it's there's no doubt it's being used. Nirmal, let's move on to another issue where the U.S. and China clearly are potentially at loggerheads, and that's Taiwan, an issue that has been around for a very long time. But things seem to be heating up, and slowly but surely, there's a big debate in the United States about how do we talk about Taiwan and what kind of commitment should we give. Clearly, the Chinese are also making clear that they have some very serious views about how to move forward, and are willing to put some military muscle behind it. Why is this issue heating up right now, Nirmal? What's happened in the last few weeks, and how concerned should we be about the possibility of a military confrontation?
I think the most significant thing that's happened in the last few weeks is that the so-called median line, which China did not, of course, recognize, but everybody else it was a notional median line between Taiwan and China, has essentially been erased, because China has sent its fighter jets over it so frequently that it doesn't really matter anymore. And so there have been fairly close encounters in the air between the Taiwanese and Chinese air forces, which is not a good thing. And as you referred to, Ivo, there's been a lot of saber rattling on the Chinese side that, this is, you don't come anywhere near Taiwan. This is a huge red line for China, right? It's also not some remote Himalayan border where you can afford to have a small battle, a skirmish here and there, right? Anything happening in the Straits of Taiwan would potentially bring in others, as like the US as well. And then so the debate here, and I'm sure both you and Carla probably know more about it than I do, is about the US's so-called strategic ambiguity, right? At some point, what does the US do? Now, this is a question in the minds of the region anyway, because of the US's various alliances there, not just Taiwan, but Philippines and so forth, and ASEAN, the South China Sea issue and so forth. What does the US do when push comes to actual shove in the region? And So this applies to Taiwan as well, and it's become more acute now because of these higher level visits the U.S. has deployed to Taiwan. Keith Crouch went there the other week, so that has stirred up opinion in China, and hence we have the saber rattling, we have the exercises, we have the confrontations, encounters, you would say, in the air between China and Taiwan, and you have the American election. And there is a fear that if there is some kind of kinetic incident in the Straits, how will it feed into the Trump campaign, right? Is it seen as swinging the election Donald Trump's way? What does he do, depending on what he does after that, right? What America does. Does it swing the election the president's way, or is it to the detriment of his campaign? There's a lot of moving parts to this. But yeah, as you said, this is the next big, for China, this is the big red line. And for the rest, it is the next big mountain to contemplate,
So Carla, I think the question for Washington is Taiwan a red line for the United States? Is now being debated, it seems to me, more than it has been in quite a while. Of course, Taiwan has been a nostalgic issue for many, particularly on Capitol Hill, but also in other places. But we're now seemingly entering a debate about, should the United States make a formal commitment to defend Taiwan or not?
It's interesting, Taiwan, this narrative, Taiwan raised the alarm about COVID early, was ignored in the WHO because it can't be a member of the WHO because of the pressure from China. And that had a certain interesting sort of greening effect for Taiwan. It used to be the decisions about, we used to go through this annual thing about arms sales, and it was a crisis because there was an annual date for it. And then we did away with the date and people stopped paying attention annually to Taiwan. Taiwan sort of faded away as a discussion point, and it was good because it stopped being a tension point. But now there's been this greening of Taiwan. There's a lot of people saying, why are we acting like they don't exist? They're a civilized country. They're a sophisticated country. Look how well they handled this. Why are they, why don't they have a seat at the table here? And so you're seeing this more and more among, among elites that for a very long time said, let's not twist the tie. So I think that's certainly a change. Is this the October surprise? A confrontation, as Nirmal seems to suggest. I don't think that's. Certainly consistently across the different, national security bureaucracies in the United States is a fierce anti-China feeling, and I think I've said many times that to Ivo that the greatest defender of China in this administration is actually the president. He's the one who really, has the love affair with Xi, although he does not talking about it right now. I think if there's a confrontation, it's going to be one we accidentally stumble into.
Philip, you wrote this morning in the FT about the confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism. And of course, Taiwan, in addition to dealing with COVID really well, it's a functioning democracy, and it's a pretty vibrant one too. And sort of making this confrontation more real in this larger context. Yeah,
the problem though, as I tried to write, is that if you look around at the president's, best friends in the world, they're not the Democrats, not Angela Merkel or even Boris Johnson. It's it's Erdogan. It's the Saudis. This isn't a president who's standing up for democracy around the world. I think there is something more profound going on here, which is a questioning around the world about the strength of America's security guarantee. We in Europe have lived, for 50, 60, 70 years under this assumption that the Americans in the end will bail us out if the Russians come over. People now are questioning that, saying, well, and the president himself has questioned Article 5 of the NATO. You go to Japan And you hear people, Japanese politicians saying, well, we're no longer quite sure how solid the American security guarantee is. Would they really, if there's a flare up in the East China Sea? And I think the same thing's happening with Taiwan. So the American global security guarantee, this idea that in the end, the US will keep the lid on things, that's going. And I think that, looking at it from China's point of view, the temptation for them is to test and to push and to see. And I wonder whether if the Russians moved into the Baltics, whether the US any longer could be expected to defend them. And I imagine a lot of people in Taiwan wonder, whereas 10 years ago they might have been pretty confident about US support, wonder whether the US would actually go to war in support of Taiwan.
Philip, I think you got it's a really important point about the future stability of the international order, which has reside on America's security guarantee. And I think one of the reasons there is this renewed push to get rid of strategic ambiguity with regard to whether or not the United States would defend Taiwan is to make that point, to reassure not just the Taiwanese, but the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians and the Philippines and the rest in Southeast Asia there, but also the Europeans, that once you let one ally go, the whole thing collapses. And yet there's then the other debate. Do we really want to go to war over Taiwan with China, which by all the military planning and wargaming we're doing, the Chinese are going to beat us when it comes to Taiwan, unless we take it to a nuclear conflict, which is not something that anybody wants. So this dilemma that has been real in America's relation with allies is there in spades, and presumably will continue no matter who's president, because it's not just about reassurance, it's about the fundamental credibility of the US political system on these issues, big issues. That we face. Nirmal, is that worry a part of what's happening in Southeast Asia as well?
Very much so, and I think you put it quite well. I mean, the fact that there's been an assumption that the US will always be around to sort things out, and across Asia, whenever India and Pakistan have had a confrontation, there's always a sense that it needs a phone call from Washington to calm things down, right? So. That is now being questioned, certainly. And I think you make a very good point that from this administration's point of view, is it worth going to war over Taiwan? I mean, this president wants to sort of end the wars. He wants to bring all the troops back, and you can see, he make a good argument. The US could say, hey, we'll sell Taiwan all the systems, all the weapon systems, everything. You pay us, we'll give you everything, state-of-the-art stuff, you defend yourself. But the view in the region then is that, well, everybody's being left to defend themselves. And that just means that either who is going to be the next imposer of order? Is it going to be China? And nobody really wants that, right? Which is why the region, certainly Southeast Asia and in India as well, now want the US to remain present in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, in the Pacific. So yeah, it's very much a worry, and I think that is why this election in the US is being seen as a huge deal. Now, some things won't change. I think, as you said, the question of whether the US will risk going to war with China over Taiwan, that is a question which is not going to go away, regardless of who wins. But in other respects, I think if Joe Biden wins, there will be a beefing up of the diplomatic quotient. I mean, so far it's been sort of carry a hammer wherever you go, right? The diplomacy has kind of taken a back seat. I think that the return of old-fashioned diplomacy, I think of the old days of shuttle diplomacy, right? Which is a bit difficult now, but they used to do that, sort of flying between capitals, talking to people, calming things down. That won't come back, of course, 100%, but you know, a return to diplomatic engagement would be welcomed.
Nirmal, Ghosh, Carla, Robbins, Philip Stevens, thanks so much for a really fantastic conversation about so many important issues today. This is all the time we have for this week. Thank you for joining us, and I wish all of you a fantastic weekend and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.